Now, deregulation. The age-long demand for deregulation of the downstream oil and gas sector of the Nigerian economy has been on for so long that it sounds like a broken record. Yes, this is because over the years, successive efforts by various government administrations have been unsuccessful in delivering a fully deregulated downstream market that should be based on the basic economic principle of demand and supply. Afterwards, the downstream oil and gas industry regulators announced the implementation of the deregulated system of the sector, promising that pricing of petroleum products will now have to follow the dictates of international oil markets, pricing mechanism, as well as the forces of demand and supply to determine the retail price of premium motor spirit, popularly known as petrol. This has since brought about inflation on the prices of fuel, resulting to a series of outcry from the general public. But what does the increase in the price of petrol mean for revenue generation for the government and for investors whose prices will no longer be controlled by the government on the guise of subsidy? Well, I have joining me to discuss this is Chief Consultant of B. Adedipe Associates, Dr. Biodun Adedipe. Thank you very much, Dr. Adedipe, for your time.
Thank you, Tolu, for having me here this afternoon.
Yes, I'm going to start this way. Deregulation. What we have on ground at the moment seems not to be total because it is really not controlled by the forces of demand and supply, not a free market. Diesel is fully deregulated, but for PMS, we really don't have that. Now, what do you make of the whole monopoly kind of in the oil and gas industry downstream? What do you really think about this reform being undertaken by the NNPC and the federal government?
All right, thank you so very much for that. I would like to start from this premise that what we actually call deregulation in Nigeria is not what it is conceptually. Now, conceptually, deregulation is meant to remove government controls towards making either a particular sector of the economy or the economy in total to become more competitive. In which case, there is a dominant player within a particular sector or the total economy, and therefore it makes for inefficiency that also inadvertently doesn't make for competitiveness that yields high productivity. Now, that on the one side. What we have also erroneously branded deregulation over the decades, not a matter of years now, is simply to look at how the price of refined petroleum products is determined. Now, the reality of it that anytime you look at any product and its market, I'm not aware of any perfect market anywhere where the strict interplay of demand and supply determines the market clearing price. There are always several other contending factors. But be that as it may, the reality that we face today in Nigeria is that there are inefficiencies caused by policies and also the kind of structure that we operate. As rightly mentioned, where you have a monopoly in terms of importation of refined products, that is a problem to start with. Now, the other side to it is how the price is determined. We use a template in Nigeria that has a number of elements there that by all means have no connection to the market and the reality of what we see today. So eventually, therefore, you see a price that does not reflect the efficiency and productivity that should drive prices in a modern economic system. And so it is not so much as deregulation per se, it is about removing the rigidities and the inconsistencies in our policies that we should actually be talking about. So that means, for example, that if you take the pricing template, there will be nothing like demurrage in that template. Because demurrage, for example, is building upfront an expectation of port inefficiency that makes you make an allowance for that in pricing your product. And then secondly, there is the aberration that a consumer at the point of discharge of imported products will pay the same price at the pump head for the same product in the interland. That, of course, is contrary to the tenets and arguments of deregulation. All right? So now these are the areas that we should be only talking about in the reforms that you mentioned. And of course, it's also something we deal with between now and hopefully when the Dangote refinery kicks into operation and we begin to source those products domestically. So for me, therefore, the real issue is how do we make that sector more competitive, that is removing monopoly to start with, and not, of course, in the process also creating new monopolies, which we have seen play out in the deregulation of some other sectors across the globe, aviation, energy, and so on and so forth, which in fact, when the regulation was mastered and also executed, those countries ended up creating a few monopolies that became oligopolies. So these are the kind of things we want to watch out for. We want efficiency, we want high productivity. But how do we get to that? It's not about talking about merely looking at the price of crude oil internationally and converting that now to the outcome of a refined barrel of crude oil, and now talking about how much a liter will cost internationally. And for that reason, therefore, we compare with how much we sell it locally here. So there are so many issues to deal with here.
Around total removal of subsidy or allowing market forces to take charge. Then we have Labour coming in, and Labour now sits with government and they start to deliberate on how to make all of these issues. Now, what do you think can be done to address these fears? Because I think what the public really fears is the fact that the price might not be controlled, and some people might take advantage of this to hike price at their own whatever rate they want to. So what do you think should be the role of Labour in all of this, and what can be done to help address the shortfall for the vulnerable ones?
Now, the way it goes is that when you look at products that impact everybody within an economy, the first question to ask is, how does the price of that particular product behave? And if the price goes up by a certain percentage, how does that impact the cost of living? If you check historically for Nigeria, since the 1960s, I'm talking about now, over the decades, every time we adjusted the price of refined products upwards, the inflation rate also spikes, which means there's a very strong correlation between the pump and price of petroleum products and inflation rate, that is, changes in the pump and prices of petroleum products. Which means then that if we really want the cost of living vis-a-vis the quality of life in Nigeria to be sustained, then we must be wary about anything that brings an increase in the pump head prices of petroleum products. Unfortunately, for us in Nigeria, we don't have a price regiment or mechanism that adjusts prices on the one hand, and also recognizes that even when the market, so to say, adjusts prices, there has to be a particular way of coming into that market to do correction, because the market system itself is not perfect. And that is why oftentimes we talk about recession, we talk about crisis, either in the economy, in financial system, banking system, and all of this. They are all pointed out to the fact that the market system is not perfect. So how now do we proceed with this? Now, we cannot eat our cake and have it. On the one hand, we can be promoting the regulation in the way we understand it, which is what we generally say removal of subsidy. I've made this argument over decades. There is no country in the world where subsidy is completely absent. But the big question before us is, what should we subsidize? Should we subsidize consumption or subsidize production? What most countries do is to subsidize production. So if you subsidize production, that helps you upfront to manage the back-end price of the product. So, and until we begin to look at something from that perspective, all we'll be talking about is, remove subsidy, and then the pump price of petroleum products will go up, and that also impacts the cost of living. So for us, I want to advocate strongly that what we should be looking at is things like refined petroleum products affect everybody, every entity. We should not leave it fully to the market forces. But how do we ensure that it's also well managed? That means we must look back and consider how we subsidize its production. So that at the end of the day, the product that comes out is at a price that is conducive to the quality of life that we desire in Nigeria. That is a very critical one that for me right now is missing Nigeria. All along, what we do is we take the price internationally, we compare with the local price, and we say there is subsidy, and then of course we see a lot of fraud also in terms of managing that over time, because we're subsidizing consumption on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're also benchmarking what completely is unrealistic. The price of refined products in another country cannot be used as a benchmark against its price locally here, because there are different conditions and different situations. And that brings me to the issue you mentioned, which is talking about the bottom of the pyramid in Nigeria.
Dr. Adedipe, allow me to interject you. We need to take a commercial break. Please, you will continue with these thoughts as we return to continue this discussion. We'll be right back. Business Nigeria is still on. Stay with us.
It's time for Eyigbeti, the private sector-led Lagos Economic Summit. This year's edition is a virtual event for business leaders, academics, techies, and entrepreneurs to set an implementable agenda for a greater Lagos. From the 16th to 18th of February 2021, participants from all over the world will converge to discuss transformational initiatives that will advance the development of Lagos State at the Eyigbeti Online Summit. At the forefront of this summit is the private sector, leading discussions that will provide government with a roadmap for Lagos till 2050. For more than 20 years, Eyigbeti has contributed significantly to infrastructural and policy development in Lagos State. Join the conversation today. Contribute your quota. Register for the conference at www.eyigbetisummit.com. Let's come together for a greater Lagos. Eyigbeti is hosted by the Lagos Economic Summit Group and powered by Zenith Bank, FMDQ, Sterling Bank, First Bank, Stanbic IBTC Pensions, STB Building Society, UBA, Providus Bank, Vetiva Capital Management, Leadway Assurance, Premium Pension, Trust Fund Pension, Ford Foundation, Nine Mobile, Unity Bank, and Chapel Hill Denham.
All right, glad to have you back. I still have Dr. Biodo Adedipe there speaking to me passionately about deregulation and what it means for Nigeria's or Africa's most populous nation. Dr. Adedipe, let me allow you land on that. You were making a submission before we went on that break. Please make your point.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, the point I was making is this. At the bottom of the pyramid is a population of about 41%. If we go by the last poverty study report by the National Bureau of Statistics, if that portion of our population is below the poverty line, that means these are the most vulnerable in terms of the implication of the deregulation we are discussing here, which in the sense I said, quote and unquote, we only think of in terms of removing subsidy on the one hand, and also allow market forces freely to determine the pump end prices of refined petroleum products, which means eventually then the burden in terms of the cost of living will fall more on the vulnerable group in the society without any plan on how to actually bring some form of protection for them. So we get the bear the full impact of that price adjustment, which is the reality. And that was why I made the point that we cannot argue for that on the one hand, and at the same time say we don't want prices of refined products to go up. If you argue for market-determined prices of refined products, you cannot escape prices going up. But if you want this to be moderated, then you need to begin to think seriously of, number one, domestic production of refined products, and secondly, even when we produce locally, we should be thinking also as subsidizing production. That is my line of thought on this.
All right, Dr. Adedipe, let's focus now on the masses. Now, people that will buy fuel, those that will buy a liter, 4 liters, 5 liters, and all of this. What initiatives do you think government needs to do? Now we find ourselves in this situation to at least lessen the effect of all of this on the masses. That is very important because purchasing power continues to drop and the price of PMS clearly will continue to increase as the price of crude also increases.
Well, I think the question is not that complex. Let me see. the way to break this up is to ask, what do they use refined petroleum products for? Okay, so apart from the percentage that we burn on the roads, a whole lot is still being used to generate power, either for domestic use or for business use. So in which case, there is a significant portion of that that goes into power generation. And what that talks to is that if we fix the power sector, then the demand for refined products, especially the portion that goes to powering generators, will almost disappear from the demand formula we are looking at. If that happens, then the pressure that comes in terms of either subsidy or what we discussed today, we also reduce significantly. So we need to get the power sector right on the one hand. Now, on the other hand also, we need to do something, and seriously too, about mass transit. And that means our major cities. The reality is that about 51% of our population now is in the urban areas. So the more the population migrates from the rural to urban areas, the more compelling it is to make a case for mass transit in the urban areas. And that means, what are we doing with intra-city rail network? What are we doing about the roads intra-city? What are we doing about planning of transportation and ensuring that we do it in a transmodal form? All of these are interrelated. When we do all this, they will fall back on the demand for refined petroleum products that will serve two main purposes. The ones that we use on the roads, which oftentimes is estimated at between 25 and 30% in most countries around the world. And of course, you look now at what we in Nigeria in particular also burn in order to generate power in our houses and our offices. So these are the directions I think government should be looking at.
Dr. Deregulation, let's end this discussion on this note, looking at the emotional issues and what we also have to do with regards to our refining. You talked about domestic refining. With the state of our 4 refineries, we're all talking most of the time now about Dangote refinery. So where do you think we also stand with issues around refining that can also help us address this issue of cost?
It is simply this. Now, everyone talks about Dangote refinery because it is a private motivation.
Okay.
As different from the government-owned refineries that have been more or less moribund. Of course, not producing, and when they produce, significantly low compared to the demand for refined products domestically. So now, given that scenario, that means we still have this burden to deal with between now and when Dangote refinery goes into operation. That's the reality of the situation we find ourselves. But again, we cannot fold our arms and wait for Dangote refinery to come into operation. So what can we do? And that's why I made the reference to what government can begin to look at right now. Even when Dangote refinery comes into operation, we must remind ourselves ahead of time that it's a private entity. And so for a private entity in pricing its products, it has no reference to subsidy or anything. So if we want the price to come out at a level that will not be counterproductive in terms of the cost of living, then we must consider a way of subsidizing that refinery, which is local here, and also have an understanding as to the way pricing of its products also will be done eventually. So it's something we have to sit down and consider very seriously. There are, of course, a couple of other refineries that are coming up, smaller in size, of course. But the question, like I said, is until we're able to produce enough locally, we continue to be subject to this challenge of correcting the pump price of crude oil that we have done since the 1960s. And that is where the real issue lies. Now, let me also quickly make a remark about, one of the things we mentioned at the beginning, and that is the implication of this for government revenue. Now, in reality, the regulation will not bring more money into the coffers of the government. Rather, what it will impact is what the government spends money on. If we deregulate the way we say it and interpret it to mean removal of subsidy, that means what government spends in funding the subsidy of petroleum products will no longer be spent on that. So that money can be available for capital spending or any other thing that can also enhance productivity within the Nigerian economy. So now that's the extent to which deregulation can impact government, what I would call revenue expenditure nexus. It's actually the relationship it affects, not revenue per se. So in terms of emotion, therefore, what I see generally is a situation where if you take one away, you should be able to put one in other form. And that is the link between the so-called adjustment to the refined products prices at the pump edge vis-a-vis what other things we can do to ensure that the impact doesn't go all the way and make life more costly and more complicated for especially the population at the bottom of the pyramid.
Dr. Biodun Adedipe, I thank you so very much for your time. I always appreciate you when you join us on this show to share your expertise with us. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.